A black woman boarded a plane, quiet and composed, just like any other passenger. But what the flight attendants didn't know was that she was an undercover FBI agent. Moments later, they singled her out, humiliated her, treated her like a problem simply because of the color of her skin. But just when they thought they had her cornered, she stood up and revealed her badge. What happened next shook the entire cabin and changed everything for the crew on board. Stay with me, because this is a story that exposes how power and prejudice can collide in the most unexpected ways. Before we begin, drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that reveal the truth behind the uniform. The airport was alive, humming like a restless city caught in the arms of its own breath. Beneath the gleam of polished floors and the metallic hiss of jet engines, Clara Jennings moved like someone who had been here before, not just in this airport, but in the unsaid place where dignity is tested and skin becomes more than skin. She moved with grace, yes, but a grace hard-earned, smoothed over by years of being watched without cause, judged without merit, and dismissed without a word spoken aloud. She carried a simple bag, wore a simple coat, and kept a simple posture. And yet, for reasons known only to those who never had to explain their assumptions, she was already a suspect, in nothing more than being present. Clara had learned, over the years, how to exist in white spaces that only pretended to be neutral. She knew that silence could be just as sharp as an insult, and that a smile could carry the weight of a threat. Her life was not a march but a maneuver, carefully considered, each step forward tested for strength and for consequence. But this flight was no different than the many before it. Except this time, she was not just a passenger. She was a witness. She was a test. The ticket clerk didn't look her in the eye. Not quite. There was a flicker, a scan, the kind of glance that checks for trouble the way you check a pocket for change. Clara felt it but said nothing. She simply tucked her boarding pass into her palm and moved toward the gate. Her path intersected with children running, businessmen on calls, an elderly couple hunched over their boarding slips, the texture of America in motion. But even in motion, the lines remain drawn. Even at 30,000 feet, people carry the fences they built on the ground. She took a seat near the boarding zone, crossed her legs, opened a small book, not to read, but to mask the vigil. It was an old skill, appearing calm while preparing for anything. Her eyes, barely lifted from the page, caught sight of two flight attendants approaching the gate counter. One tall, taut, with the air of someone who'd forgotten how to soften. The other, younger, nervous in the shoulders, eyes flickering like she hadn't yet learned where to look when she didn't want to see. Clara felt the glance before it landed. It was not overt. Nothing ever was. But it was real. It said, "We saw you." It said, "We wonder what you're doing here." And Clara, in her stillness, answered silently, "I've been here longer than you've known to ask that question." She clutched the envelope in her lap a little tighter. Not because she was afraid, but because it held weight, real weight. Not just the assignment it carried, but the history it represented. A history of showing up and being told, not directly, but firmly, that showing up was too much. When they called her boarding group, she rose, smoothed her skirt, offering a gentle thank you to the man behind her who'd let her go ahead. Politeness, after all, had always been both shield and weapon. She stepped forward. The flight attendant at the door, the tall one, with the name tag that read Margot, looked at her boarding pass with a smile too tight for courtesy. 17B, she said, as though it explained something. Clara nodded. Thank you. Margot's gaze followed her a beat too long, like she expected something to fall, or break, or unravel. Clara had seen that look before, in department stores, in classrooms, in waiting rooms. Always a look that asked a question without words. Why are you here? And always, Clara answered it the same way, by staying. She walked the aisle slowly, deliberately. Each row she passed whispered its own assumptions. A man glanced up and immediately looked away. A woman clutched her purse closer. None of them said anything, but silence, as Baldwin once wrote, is often the loudest lie. At her seat, she stowed her bag, sat down, took another breath. The fight hadn't started, not yet. But she could feel its rhythm begin, slow, like a drum from somewhere deep, gathering strength. And as the cabin filled with laughter, chatter, and the static of pre-flight announcements, Clara remained quiet. She knew the storm was coming. Not from the sky, but from within the cabin. From the way people decide who they think you are and how quickly they act on that assumption. The thing about racism, Clara often thought, is that it doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it brings you a plastic cup of water and spills it in your lap just to see how you'll react. And on this flight, Clara had a choice: endure as she always had, or reveal. But not yet. Not just yet. First, let them show themselves. The cabin lights dimmed to a dull glow, casting everything in a soft, golden hush that tried to imitate calm. Clara adjusted herself in her seat, careful not to disturb the woman beside her who hadn't offered more than a tight nod when she sat down. It wasn't personal, not exactly. But Clara had come to know how discomfort looked when it couldn't name itself. It lived in the way people shifted slightly away, the way they tightened their lips instead of smiling back. That distance, that careful avoidance, was never neutral. It had roots. The plane had not yet left the tarmac, and already Clara could feel it, awaiting, not from her, but around her. Like the people in uniform, the ones who claimed service with their starched collars and clipped tones, had already decided she would be the one to watch. Not loudly, but consistently. As if she might turn dangerous at any moment, simply by existing too freely. Marianne, the senior flight attendant, tall, blonde, crisp like winter air, passed down the aisle, offering smiles to some, nods to others. When she reached Clara's row, she didn't speak. Just glanced down, made a small correction to an overhead bin that didn't need correcting, and kept moving. It would have been forgettable if it hadn't felt so familiar. Clara had been looked at that way her entire life, as if the sight of her came with an asterisk. The woman beside her, pale, silent, leaned slightly toward the window, as though to suggest she wanted quiet. Clara didn't take offense. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to pay attention, to bear witness, to gather what could not be gathered by camera or recording, the silent weight of how people act when they think no one important is watching. The captain's voice crackled overhead. A standard welcome. Flight time. Weather forecast. Smooth ride expected. Clara listened, but only faintly. What caught her attention wasn't the message, but the tone. Something strained. Not fear, no. Just that brittle edge men often have when they think the world has failed to give them the applause they were promised. The flight lifted into the sky with the usual hum of effort, the wheels tucking in like secrets, the cabin pressing gently against backs and shoulders, reminding everyone just how much trust they had placed in metal and human hands. Clara closed her eyes, briefly, said a quiet prayer, not for safety, but for clarity. She had a feeling she'd need it. Half an hour passed before the first crack appeared. The younger flight attendant, a brunette with nervous hands, brought the drink cart down the aisle. She asked each passenger for their choice with a rehearsed tone that said she'd rather be elsewhere. When she reached Clara, her voice wavered just slightly. Water, Clara said simply, offering a kind smile. As the cup was handed over, it tipped, not drastically, just enough to send a splash across Clara's wrist and blouse. "Oh," the attendant said, too quickly. "Sorry." Clara took the offered napkin without a word. She had long since learned not to make people nervous, especially not when you're black, alone, and at 30,000 feet. The woman beside her shifted, murmuring something inaudible. The cart moved on. It wasn't the spill, Clara thought. It was the look afterward. The way the attendant didn't meet her eyes again. The way she rushed past, as though shamed not by the act, but by Clara's composure. There is a power in quiet dignity, but it often makes people uncomfortable, especially those who expect submission. Clara dabbed at the water slowly. Not because it would help, the blouse was already stained, but because it gave her a moment to center herself. She thought of her father, who used to say, "They'll come for you soft before they come for you hard. Watch the softness, that's where it hides." He'd been a preacher, not in a church, but in the streets, a man who taught truth without needing a pulpit. And she heard his voice now, warning her not to let this moment pass unnoticed. Something had begun, and it wouldn't end here. Later, when the food service came, Clara declined. She wasn't hungry, but she noticed that the same woman in uniform, Marianne, stood now just a row ahead, her eyes cutting occasionally toward Clara's seat. Clara sat still, not afraid, just aware. A man across the aisle, white, older, with reading glasses, had been watching. Not rudely, just attentively. Their eyes met briefly. He nodded, a small gesture, but a human one. Clara returned it. She didn't know if he understood what was happening, not fully, but he knew something wasn't right. The rest of the cabin was wrapped in the illusion of peace. People laughing at movies, signing into neck pillows, flipping through magazines without seeing a single word. And still, Clara felt it. That subtle tilt. That imbalance. Because the thing about racism, the kind that doesn't shout, is that it doesn't need a reason. It doesn't need slurs or fire or fists. Sometimes, all it needs is a uniform. And a little power. She remembered her mother's words. They don't have to raise their voice to put you in your place. Sometimes they'll do it with a smile. And tonight, on this plane, the smiles were starting to fade. Clara leaned her head back, closed her eyes again. The story wasn't finished, but the rhythm had begun. She hadn't moved. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing and everything at once, the kind of gaze you earn after years of needing to see more than what's simply in front of you. The tray table remained locked. The water-stained blouse had dried in patches. And yet, the dampness wasn't what she felt. What she felt was heat, low and steady, the kind of heat that simmers just beneath the skin when you know someone is watching you not out of care, but out of control. Across the aisle, the older white gentleman had long since turned back to his reading. But Clara noticed something peculiar. Every few minutes, his eyes would lift just above his glasses, peeking once more toward her row. It wasn't intrusive. If anything, it felt like a silent witnessing, that rare, human recognition that something unsaid was unfolding. Meanwhile, the woman beside Clara, quiet for most of the flight, had pulled a cashmere shawl up to her chin and was pretending to sleep. But her occasional stiff shifts told a different story. She wasn't sleeping. She was waiting. Waiting for something she couldn't name, but might soon understand. Then it came, small, deliberate, unnecessary. Marianne, the senior flight attendant, returned to Clara's row. No cart this time. No smile either. Just a clipboard in hand and that unmistakable air of performance, as though every movement were for a hidden audience. "Ma'am," she said. Her voice was honey-dipped in frost. "I need to verify your seat." Clara didn't flinch. "Excuse me," I said. Marianne repeated, louder this time. "I need to verify that you're in the correct seat. We've had some issues with mismatches today." Her pause wasn't accidental. That breath before the word mismatches landed like a coded slur, the kind you could deny in court, but not in conscience. Clara held her gaze, not with anger, but with the weariness of 1,000 such encounters. 17B, she said. Middle seat. On my boarding pass and in my reservation. Would you like to see it? Marianne hesitated. Not because she needed proof, but because she hadn't expected Clara to meet her calmly. "That won't be necessary," Marianne replied, though her posture remained stiff, like she had wanted a different scene. A louder one. one that could justify the script she was prepared to read from. She scribbled something on her clipboard, real or imagined, and turned away. The woman beside Clara let out the faintest breath, like a kettle letting go of its steam. Clara didn't turn to her. Didn't need to. That noise said everything. They sat in silence again, but now the silence was heavier. Not because anything explosive had happened, but because it hadn't. That was the cruelty. That was the genius. Racism didn't need to shout. It whispered. It is documented. It made notes it never had to explain. 2 rows ahead, a white passenger reclined his seat too far and was politely asked to adjust. The flight attendant even laughed. A few seats back, a young child spilled juice, and it was met with understanding, coos of kindness. But Clara, still, silent Clara, was asked to verify that she belonged. And the worst part? This wasn't new. In every American city, in every American church, in every classroom and courtroom, there are Black women carrying the same weight, the burden of needing to be composed even when wrongly accused, the burden of proof when everyone else is granted the luxury of assumption. Clara leaned back in her seat. Not tired, not yet. Just certain. Certain that this was a fight not of fists, but of perception. And perception, she had learned, is the first battlefield of identity. If they can make the room believe you're a problem, then they don't need a reason to solve you. The plane hummed on. Outside, clouds passed like white lies. Inside, Clara made a quiet decision. She would not flinch again. Not if they searched her seat. Not if they questioned her bag. Not if they asked why she didn't smile more. Because to flinch is to give the performance they crave, the angry Black woman, the unruly passenger, the disruption in their otherwise safe, white world. No. She would stay still. She would be silent the way a stone is silent, not absent, but immovable. And when they came again, and they would, she would still be there. Calm, centered, and unafraid. Because being Black in America wasn't just about endurance. It was about strategy. And Clara knew the most radical thing she could do now was remain exactly as she was. The hours wore on, not in time but in tension. Clara had not changed her posture. Her seat remained upright, her legs crossed at the ankle, her hands resting gently upon the small paperback she hadn't touched in some time. What she read now was not printed in ink, but in gesture, in glances, in the quiet choreography of bias that moved around her like smoke. And like smoke, it was difficult to name, yet impossible to ignore. 2 more times, Marianne, that sentinel in navy polyester, passed her row. The first time was slow, observational, as though she were taking inventory of Clara's presence. Not of her seat, not of her luggage, but of her stillness, her silence, her refusal to shrink. The second time, Marianne paused, long enough to pull something from the overhead bin across the aisle, but not before allowing her eyes to settle once more on Clara. "You seem uncomfortable," she said suddenly. Clara looked up, slow and sure. "No," she replied evenly. "I'm fine." The words hung between them like 2 different languages, one of clarity, the other of coded suggestion. "I just want to make sure everyone's having a smooth flight," Marianne added, though her tone betrayed no warmth. "I'm sure you do," Clara replied, not as an accusation, but as a statement, a recognition that even the language of care can be bent to serve control. Marianne gave no response, only a nod. Then she moved on, as though she hadn't already marked Clara for something she couldn't quite name, but deeply resented. Across the aisle, the older white gentleman had now folded his newspaper. He looked toward Clara again, not out of curiosity this time, but out of concern. Perhaps he'd seen enough. Perhaps he'd finally recognized what was happening, not as an incident, but as a pattern. That's the thing about racism in flight. It does not wear a hood, and it rarely yells. No, it dresses well. It smiles tightly. It asks to verify your seat. It spills water with an apology too slowly. And eventually, it makes a report. It was barely 10 minutes later when Alicia, the younger attendant, returned, clipboard in hand. Her movements were quicker than Marianne's, her smile more honest, but her shoulders were bowed by an invisible weight. "Miss," she began, "I was asked to check. There was a concern about something in your bag." Clara blinked once. "What concern?" she asked, her voice flat, unblinking. Alicia hesitated. "Nothing specific. Just." Marianne wanted confirmation. "We've had incidents in the past. It's just a formality." Clara didn't laugh. There was nothing funny about being considered an incident. "I have no problem complying," she said. "But I would like to know what prompted this." Alicia glanced over her shoulder toward the front of the plane. Marianne stood near the galley, arms folded, watching like a hawk too proud to admit it hunted for sport. Clara reached under her seat slowly, pulled out her modest black handbag, and unzipped it with the precision of someone who had done this before, not with the TSA, but with a world that always wanted her to prove she belonged. Alicia peeked inside, seeing nothing more than a wallet, a phone, a paperback novel, and a small container of mints. "Thank you," she said softly, embarrassed. "You're all good." Clara looked at her, not with anger, but with the deep ache of someone who knows the difference between a servant and a participant. "You're just doing your job," she said. "But that doesn't mean you don't have a choice." Alicia flinched ever so slightly. "I know." The silence that followed said everything about the limits of decency, the cruelty of complicity, and the cost of being black while doing nothing at all. Clara repacked her bag, placed it gently beneath her seat, and folded her hands again. She stared out the window at the cotton swell of clouds and wondered how many of her people had flown over this country praying not to be noticed. It wasn't always this dramatic: no fire hoses, no snarling dogs, no sheriffs with drawn guns. But the pressure was the same. The suggestion that to be black in a white space was to be an anomaly, a potential threat, a cause for scrutiny, an error to be corrected before it grew bold enough to speak back. That's what Marianne wanted. Not a bag check, a performance. She wanted Clara to react, to resist, to raise her voice just enough to be labeled uncooperative. She wanted a spectacle, because if there was a spectacle, there could be a report. And if there was a report, she could be right and the system could protect her. But Clara wasn't going to give her that. She had learned long ago that dignity isn't loud. It's deliberate. That sometimes the most radical act of protest is restraint. The plane had reached cruising altitude, but down in the cabin, nothing was settled. The lights were dimmed now, the sky outside like a curtain drawn against judgment. Some passengers dozed beneath airline-issued blankets, heads tilted back, mouths slightly open, unaware that a different kind of turbulence stirred just a few rows away. Clara sat unmoving, not because she was comfortable, but because she had learned, long ago, that the less you move, the fewer excuses you give them to come for you. She didn't know exactly what them meant anymore, not just people like Marianne, the flight attendant with a tight smile and tighter mind, but a system so refined in its discrimination it could hide behind a tray table and still control the room. Alicia hadn't come back, and Clara knew what that meant. Either the girl had been silenced, or she had surrendered. It wasn't until the beverage cart rolled around again that Clara saw Marianne's face, firm, almost smug now. Whatever internal war had been brewing earlier had found its resolution. And the enemy, as always, was the one sitting quietly, black, and out of place. Marianne didn't speak when she arrived. She just stood there, eyes on Clara, as if waiting for a confession. Clara looked up, softly. "May I have some tea, please?" Marianne said nothing for a moment. Then, too slowly, she poured the water. The bag, an herbal blend, was tossed on the tray like a paper receipt. And she moved on without a word. It wasn't just rudeness. It was a ritual. It was the ceremony of power. And the tea, like the earlier inspection of Clara's bag, wasn't about safety or service. It was about sending a message. "We're watching you. You don't belong here." A few minutes later, Clara caught the sound, not loud, but distinct, of whispering just behind her row. She turned slightly. Two passengers, one of whom had earlier shared a laugh with Marian near the galley, now looked at her with a strange mixture of interest and suspicion. "Are you sure she didn't say anything?" one murmured. "Didn't see her do much, but you never know. Some folks get really defensive when you ask questions." That was all Clara needed to hear. She wasn't just being observed now. She was being narrated. The worst part about prejudice in America wasn't that it existed, that had always been the case. It was how it disguised itself as reason. How quickly a black woman asking for tea could become a disruption in someone else's story. By the time the seatbelt sign lit up again, this time with no turbulence in sight, Clara knew something was coming. It was Alicia who returned, pale and hesitant, the shadows under her eyes deepening. "Miss Brown," she whispered. The captain would like to speak with you. Privately." He said it won't take long." Clara's hands stayed still. Her heart did not. "About what?" Alicia swallowed. "Just protocol." He didn't say much more. Clara stood, slow and deliberate. She looked at the elderly white man across the aisle, the one who had watched the earlier inspection with troubled eyes. He gave a soft nod. He saw this for what it was. The walk to the front of the plane felt longer than it was. Passengers lifted their eyes, curious. The curtain to the front cabin parted. Behind it stood the captain, young, white, and expressionless. His arms were folded, a security air, as though she'd stepped into a courtroom. "Miss Brown," he said, "we've had a few concerns raised by our crew about your behavior." Clara raised an eyebrow. "What behavior?" "Uncooperative tone. Suspicion about items in your possession. Noncompliance with instructions." Clara stared at him. "I compiled. Every time. There's been no incident, only insinuation." The captain blinked. He wasn't expecting poise. He wasn't expecting clarity. He was expecting fear. "I'm going to have to ask for your identification," he said, his voice taut. "And I'll need to record this interaction." It was then Clara realized something deeper. This was not just about humiliation. It was about documentation. They were preparing a case, not of truth, but of perception. "Captain," she said, her voice unwavering, "if this is your standard for investigating passengers, I'd like the name of every individual who made these complaints. I'd also like a copy of this report and a written statement explaining what policy I violated." The captain shifted. "That's not standard procedure. And neither is singling out a black woman who hasn't so much as raised her voice." It was Alicia, standing behind them, who broke the tension. "Captain, if I may." He cut her off. "Thank you, Alicia. That will be all." But it was too late. She'd spoken. And in that moment, Clara knew she wasn't alone. Not completely. Not yet. She reached into her bag, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a laminated ID. It wasn't the FBI. It wasn't anything dramatic. Just a state-issued license, a university faculty badge, and a laminated letter from a civil rights watchdog group verifying her role as a volunteer monitor in discrimination cases. The captain looked at it, and his posture changed. Not because he believed her, but because now there was paperwork. Now she could not be erased so easily. "I suggest," Clara said, voice low, "that you reconsider how this plane defines a threat. Because so far, the only thing I've threatened is someone's comfort with being in control." She turned back to the aisle, and as she walked past the passengers, some eyes curious, some ashamed, she did not flinch. Let them watch. Let them wonder what she had done. It was time, she thought, to start letting them ask the better question. What has been done to her? The plane coasted steadily over the middle states, somewhere between Missouri and Memory. Clara Brown sat back in her seat now, but not in ease. No, it was the kind of stillness taught to black folks long ago. The stillness that says, don't move too fast. Don't talk too loud. Don't give them a reason. because the world had already decided that being born with her shade of skin was reason enough. And yet something had changed. A small shift in gravity, not in the cabin, but in the eyes of the passengers around her. They had seen her get up. They had seen her walk to the front. They had watched the curtain close behind her, like the gates of some high court where justice was a rumor and judgment wore a pilot's badge. And they had seen her return, head high, steps slow, dignity intact. But still, not one had spoken. No one had asked, "Are you all right?" Not yet. That silence was not ignorance. It was fear. Fear that if they named the wrongness, they'd be pulled into it. Better to look down. Better to look away. That's how most injustices survive, not by the might of the few who enforce them, but by the retreat of the many who let them. Across the aisle, the old white man who had nodded earlier shifted in his seat. He looked over at Clara, hesitated, then leaned in. "I saw what happened," he said, voice low, almost ashamed. "And I'm sorry." Clara turned to him gently. "For what?" "For not saying something sooner." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "That's how it always goes," she said. "Silence follows us like a shadow. But shadows don't make the sun less bright." The old man nodded slowly, and Clara turned back to the window. The sky stretched out like possibilities, endless and blue. And that was when the whispering began again. It came from 3 rows up, where a woman in a beige cashmere sweater was talking to her husband. She must have said something to be called that. You don't just get summoned unless there's a reason. Her voice was just loud enough to be heard, just low enough to deny it if challenged. Clara didn't move, but she heard it. Everyone heard it. That's the thing about racism at 30,000 feet. It doesn't need a bullhorn. It only needs a whisper and a captive audience. The woman in beige looked back, saw Clara watching, and offered a tight smile, the kind that says I'm not racist, but thinks maybe you made them uncomfortable. Clara did not return the smile. She turned instead to Alicia, who passed by with the beverage cart again, her face drawn, her eyes darting toward the cockpit like a child watching a storm that hasn't hit yet. "Miss," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "You all right?" Alicia blinked. It was the first time someone on that flight had asked her that question. "Yes," she lied, and then paused. "No, not really." Clara tilted her head. "You know what he's doing is wrong." Alicia nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I do. But it's not my place." Clara looked her squarely in the face. "Then who does it belong to? If not yours, then whose?" Alicia said nothing, but her hands shook a little less as she poured the drinks. A few rows back, a black teenager glanced up from his earbuds, catching Clara's eye. He didn't say anything, just held her gaze, and nodded. One nod passed between them like a torch. That was how it spread, not with fire, but with recognition. The next sign came when a white woman, probably in her 50s, pushed her call button. She had said nothing until now, but when Alicia approached, she gestured toward Clara. "Excuse me, miss," she said. "I just want to say that what happened earlier wasn't right. If there's a report or a form or anything, I'll write my name down." Clara heard it, and for the first time, she smiled, not for joy, but for knowing. Change didn't come through confrontation alone. Sometimes it arrived quietly on the backs of the unsure, the embarrassed, the late-to-the-truth folks who still decided to speak. Then, suddenly, the intercom buzzed. "This is your captain," came the voice from the front, the same captain who'd summoned Clara like she was a suspect, not a scholar. "We'll be beginning our descent into New York shortly. I'd like to thank all of you for your cooperation today." Clara didn't believe in coincidences. The descent was early, just enough to shake the nerves, just enough to remind everyone who held the buttons. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this descent wasn't about altitude. It was about his power slipping. Because now, Clara had witnesses. And worse for him, she had empathy. From the woman in the window seat who once said nothing. From the old man who hadn't known how to start. from Alicia, who now walked a little straighter as she passed, and from the truth itself, which, when given enough time, always descended with more weight than any plane ever could. As the wheels prepared to touch ground, Clara folded her hands, leaned back, and thought, "They will land this flight, but they will not escape the landing of consequence." The tires screeched against the tarmac at JFK like they were carrying the weight of an unspoken history, a history that, for Clara Brown, didn't start in row 17 and didn't end in the hush of descent. It began long before she ever boarded a plane, and it would carry on long after the seatbelt sign was switched off. But something shifted the moment they landed, not in the sky, but in the eyes of the people who had witnessed what should never have happened. Now, there was no denying. The whispers had been heard. The silence had grown teeth. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Clara sat upright, her hands folded over her lap like a woman preparing for trial. But she wasn't afraid. No. She had passed the point of fear 3 decades ago when she learned the cost of keeping your head down. The price of being palatable. Of surviving instead of living. In the row ahead, the couple in beige had stopped whispering. They weren't asleep, they were pretending to be. Because when truth walks down the aisle, people learn to close their eyes like blinds. But even closed eyes can't unsee. Over the intercom, the captain's voice returned, tight and clipped. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at our destination. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying with us today." That was all. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just scripted civility. Clara glanced at Alicia, the young flight attendant, whose shoulders were now squared, not slumped. She had grown something in the air between takeoff and touchdown, a spine, maybe, or perhaps a quiet fury. The door to the cockpit opened briefly, and out stepped the captain, tall, white, and full of performance. His eyes scanned the rows like a man checking for loose threads. He didn't look at Clara. Not directly. But he hesitated when he neared her row, as though the air got thicker there. He cleared his throat. "Thank you for flying." She stared at him. And then, as calm as a preacher naming a sin, she replied, "You'll be hearing from the bureau." It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Passengers 2 rows back straightened. Alicia turned slowly. The captain blinked. It was the kind of sentence that carried no threat, only fact. And facts have a weight that even uniforms can't ignore. By the time the seatbelt light chimed off and people began standing, you could feel the unease moving like current. No one shoved. No one laughed. Everyone waited, not just to exit, but to see what would happen next. Clara stood last. Not out of fear, but out of discipline. Because people like her had learned to be the last in line and still carry the heaviest truth. She reached the front of the cabin just as 2 airport security personnel arrived at the door, summoned by the captain, likely under the guise of protocol. They looked from him to her, confused. Before anyone could speak, Clara reached into her bag and produced the small black wallet that had stayed hidden all flight. She flipped it open with quiet grace, the emblem of the bureau gleaming under the sterile terminal lights. "I'm Special Agent Clara Brown. Badge number 22719. I was on board conducting an internal investigation regarding discriminatory conduct on this route." The captain's mouth moved, but no sound followed. One of the officers blinked. Alicia, standing behind the beverage cart, dropped her shoulders with audible relief. The terminal hushed. Even the overhead announcements seemed to dim. And in that moment, the balance of power, so often tipped by uniforms, by assumptions, by the ghosts of America's long racial memory, began to tip the other way. The captain tried to recover. "Agent Brown, if I had known." She cut him off, not with volume, but with precision. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with decency." And that was the judgment. Not the badge, not the rank, but the moral clarity of a person refusing to be silent in the face of small cruelties that add up to centuries of pain. Passengers began to file out, slowly, thoughtfully. The old white man who had spoken earlier gave Clara a subtle nod as he passed. The teenager from the back row mouthed the words, "Thank you." And Alicia, who had held her voice like a secret, now looked Clara in the eye with something that resembled pride. The captain stepped aside. He did not speak again. He did not meet her gaze. Because somewhere deep down, he knew that the silence he upheld, the bias he masked as procedure, had been exposed, not by a shout, but by a steady, unrelenting truth. And the truth was this: sometimes justice doesn't come with sirens or headlines. Sometimes it walks off a plane in sensible shoes, holding a boarding pass and a badge. And it leaves behind not fear, but a memory, one that stains the air just long enough to remind everyone on board. You never know who's watching. They say that justice, when it comes, arrives like thunder. But that's not true. Not always. Sometimes, justice arrives as a conversation in a conference room at dawn. Other times, it's a meeting behind glass doors, the kind of doors where policy is drafted, but people rarely enter. And every now and then, justice walks softly into the places where silence once sat. 3 days had passed since Agent Clara Brown stepped off Delta Flight 1435 and handed her badge to the security detail at JFK. 3 days of paperwork. 3 days of statements from passengers, from the second flight attendant Alicia, from the black man in the crisp suit whose dignity had nearly been mistaken for disruption. 3 days of emails from attorneys and panicked executives. 3 days of corporate scrambling, not because they didn't know, but because they'd been caught. Now she sat across from a polished table, her badge tucked beside a plain black notebook, as the airline's internal affairs director tried not to sweat through his pressed collar. "I want to be clear, Agent Brown," he said, voice too smooth, too rehearsed. "We take these allegations very seriously." Clara folded her hands. "Do you?" He paused, flinched at the directness of her gaze. People often do when they are no longer protected by indifference. Because Clara wasn't here to entertain their apologies or to be pacified by corporate language. She had seen how systems work. She'd seen it in courtrooms, in classrooms, in church basements, in small southern towns, and in the polished terminals of New York City. The costumes change, but the script stays the same. And the script was this: deny, deflect, delay, until the damage becomes too loud to ignore. "You understand," he continued, "there's protocol to follow. Investigations, training, sensitivity workshops." Clara stopped him gently. "Tell me, Mr. Langston, what training prepares a grown woman to see a black passenger as a threat before he speaks? What protocol instructs a crew member to accidentally spill water on a black woman's lap in row 17? What kind of sensitivity training teaches someone to whisper to a stranger, 'If she causes trouble, let me know'?" The man faltered. "Those were isolated incidents." "No," she said. "That's your comfort talking. These are not isolated. They are inherited." And that was the crux of it. You see, racism in America doesn't always wear white hoods or burn crosses anymore. Sometimes it wears a blue uniform and says "ma'am" with a smirk. It smiles at you while checking your boarding pass twice. It offers a napkin after spilling water, then watches you clean yourself up. It hides behind policy and hides behind, "just doing my job." And so Clara made them see it. She filed her report with the Bureau, not just on Marjorie, the flight attendant, but on the entire crew rotation schedule, the list of passenger complaints from prior flights, and an attached memo titled, "Systemic Conduct Review of Discriminatory Cabin Incidents, Route 1435. She brought receipts, dates, witnesses. Even Alicia, who had once trembled at the idea of speaking out, signed her statement. Quiet courage had found its voice. But the real shift happened in the waiting area. At the baggage claim. In the text threads between strangers who had once been fellow passengers. Because stories like Clara's don't end when the plane lands. They ripple. One man, the black businessman who had almost been detained, launched a civil rights suit. Another woman, who had filmed part of the confrontation, posted it online. Within 24 hours, the footage reached 1 million views. Within 48, it reached Congress. And somewhere in Georgia, an old black woman, 74, skin soft with years, voice heavy with memory, watched the video on her granddaughter's phone and whispered, "Well, I'll be damned." She stood up. Yes, Clara stood up. But not to make history. She stood up because that's what black women have always done, in buses, in courtrooms, in classrooms, and now in pressurized cabins hurtling 30,000 feet above the ground. And yet, this story isn't about an agent or a flight. It's about what it means to live in a country that keeps testing your grace. It's about the cost of enduring silence. It's about how people will smile in your face while waiting for you to break, and what happens when, instead of breaking, you speak clearly, lawfully, and with the full weight of your ancestors behind you. So when they ask what happened on that flight, you tell them this: a black woman was treated unfairly. And this time, she had the power and the authority to show the world what that really looks like. And let that be the final word. Not because racism disappeared. Not because justice was served on a silver tray. But because someone stood up and didn't sit back down.